Best UK Politician in 2010, the Newcomer of the Year, the Best All-Rounder in Total Politics, MP of the Year in the Women in Public Life, the Political Studies Association Influencing the Political Agenda, and Progressive of the Year. And finally, she's won the award, the Observer Award for Politician of the Year 3 times in 27, 9 and 10. And finally, in 2008, she was listed by The Guardian as one of 50 people who could save the planet. I won't ask who the other 49 were. So, saving the planet, welcome. This is why we're here. Thank you.
I think after that introduction, it can only be downhill from here. So thank you for that all the same. And it was a very long introduction, but I want to add one other quick thing, which is that I'm also chair of the cross-party group on nuclear disarmament in the Westminster Parliament. And I just want to assure you that that group does continue. I don't think we've got any Conservatives on it at the moment, so it's not an all-party group, but it is a cross-party group, and in particular SNP, Labour, Lib Dems, of course, and we're really trying to get as much energy behind that group to get more motions and debates in Parliament. The trouble is, in order to be able to make a bid for those debates, it does need to have Conservatives on it as well. And although Crispin, actually, as you know, as the local MP, in some ways is quite sympathetic to the issue of nuclear weapons, we need to get him to sign a few more motions so we can get those debates in Parliament being had as well. But that group is there and is still active. And of course, in the old days before Jeremy was leader of the Labour Party, he was the chair of that group and I was the vice chair. Now he's the leader of the Labour Party. I'm the chair of that group. Anyway, that's just to give you a bit of insight into what's happening in Parliament. But I just wanted to really thank you for the invitation to kick off a debate this evening about safety and security in a dangerous world. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to really explore tonight, and I hope that we might be able to, in particular, look at it in our discussion afterwards, is how we do get the issue of nuclear weapons back properly onto the political agenda. What can we learn, for example, from Extinction Rebellion, from the school climate strikes and so on? What allies can we make? And it feels to me that those are very obvious allies for us. Because unless we're working with those other movements, I think that we won't get the kind of profile and energy and momentum behind the cause that we so desperately need. Because Extinction Rebellion obviously has put an amazing spotlight onto what will happen to our peoples, to the peoples of the world and the species that we share this precious world with in the event of a climate crisis. But we also know that in a nuclear crisis, the same challenges are there. And so to me, it feels as if we should be exploring how we could really key into some of that momentum and in particular mobilize some of the young people around this debate as well. Because although, as you've just heard, it was in the 50s and 60s where growing up we were thinking about nuclear war a lot. I certainly was. I feel that, my childhood was absolutely in the context of, some of those films like 1984 and all of the role of, what's he called? Briggs, Raymond Briggs, thank you. All of that felt very, very real as I was growing up. And yet to my kids, it's just not, it just feels like, well, that was then, that was the old days, and that sense that we are in as dangerous position now in many ways, if not more dangerous, not least because of the personnel in charge of the nuclear weapons now, seems to be something that we haven't yet really been able to communicate in an effective way to the younger generation. And I think somehow we need to explore how we can best do that. So I want to explore tonight how we wage peace together rather than waging war. I wanted to start with a quote from the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who said, "When storms come, some build walls, some are thrown by the wind, and others build windmills." And as we talk this evening about safety and security, I want us to try to identify ways in which we can all be, in a sense, windmill builders, and how we can inspire others to join us to do the same. So let me start with the storms that are raging around us right now, because whilst we have made real progress since CND was founded back in 1958, there are still a great many storms that we face, and you hardly need me to remind you, but I was just beginning to make a list of some of the countries that continue to be riven by armed conflict, and frankly I kind of gave up after I got to about 15 of them because the list is huge. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Kashmir, Kenya, Nigeria, Palestine, Libya, South Sudan, and many others. And all of that, which is an easy list to say, but when you actually think about the suffering that that means, millions of lives destroyed and millions of futures stolen. And if there was ever a moment to kind of reflect on that, then it seems that this week is a good one, because we can reflect on the UK's complicity with some of that, unfortunately, as our capital, London, plays superhost to the biggest arms fair in the world, DSEI, that biennial festival of death, quite frankly, where arms traders gather to promote their wares and drive that seemingly endless cycle of war. So this is all taking place in the context of a UK government increasingly desperate to make deals with any despot that they can find, that cozies up to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, that is enthralled to an outdated and, I would argue, discredited Cold War era understanding of what really constitutes security and defence in the modern world. Trident, of course, is the absolute example of that. In July 2016, just a few weeks after the Brexit vote changed this country forever, Theresa May was busily pushing through the Commons a vote for money to build the new dreadnought submarines to carry the nuclear weapons into the 2050s. Now, I spoke in the Commons chamber and made the case against Trident renewal, as, to his credit, did Reigate's MP Crispin Blunt, who was a former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. One of the arguments that I think both of us made was that Trident will be redundant even in military terms well before it's ever delivered, not least because developments in underwater technology will make the submarines easily trackable literally within the next decade. So what we're faced with is £200 billion, or even more by some estimates, being wasted on an inhumane, useless, and hopefully soon to be illegal weapon of mass destruction. And as you all know, Trident is of absolutely no use whatsoever against today's threats. From a resurgence in far-right populism and nationalisms to the politics of hatred, from ever-widening global inequality to nations undertaking cyber attacks on one another's democratic structures, our lasting safety cannot be pursued and cannot be secured with bombs or bullets or boots on the ground. So in that debate in Parliament that I'm just referencing, I would argue that we won the argument, but sadly we didn't win the vote. No discussion on global security can go very far without referencing, of course, the greatest threat to our global security today, which I believe is the climate crisis. We're currently on track for between 3 and 5 degrees warming, and that alone is a death sentence for countless people in the global south. And the effects on migration, on economic systems, on food scarcity will only increase the risk of war and militarization. And interestingly, I think it's significant that many in the defence services themselves are beginning to understand that the climate crisis is already one of the most strategic threats that we face. And there are reports that have been produced by the Pentagon, among others, who are now recognising the seriousness of the climate crisis. It's not leading to action, but at least it is being recognised that essentially coastal flooding, climate-driven migration, rising food prices due to drought and water stress will be among some of the most significant impacts of climate breakdown over the next 30 years, and that these pose significant humanitarian and security threats. A weapon system like Trident that is designed to kill and maim millions of people is not just singularly ill-equipped to defend against the dangers of climate change. Its use would actually make us significantly less safe, including from a climate perspective. And it's been estimated that the combined explosive power of just the missiles on one nuclear submarine would cause catastrophic environmental and climate disruption, causing crops to fail and up to 2 billion people to starve. And so if we were in any doubt about it, it's clear that nuclear winter is not the answer to an overheating climate. Now, you've already had reference to the residents of 10 Downing Street and the White House, but it is significant, I think, now that there is both Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, and in the context of Brexit, they are likely to be looking at ever stronger relationships between their two administrations. And of course, when it comes to Boris Johnson at 10 Downing Street, he did indeed vote in favour of Trident renewal 3 years ago. He has long-standing links, actually, also with climate sceptics, and a very poor track record when it comes to tackling the climate crisis. On his first trip to Scotland as Prime Minister just a week or so ago, he went straight to the Faslane nuclear base, had lots of photographs of himself taken on a Trident submarine with a huge smile on his face. He's appointed Ben Wallace as his Defence Secretary, who stepped into Parliament from his role as Overseas Director for the British defence contractor Quintic. The government's also pushing for new nuclear energy in the UK, disregarding the spiralling cost, no plans for storing the waste, and with seemingly no concern for the timescales dictated by climate science, which of course mean that energy efficiency and renewable energy need to be the places we put our investment, not into nuclear power. And of course there are direct links between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, and indeed there is research that's been done by the University of Sussex which is suggesting that actually one of the main reasons that the government wants to see a continuation of nuclear power has got actually very little to do with our energy needs, because anyone can see that nuclear power is costly, incredibly slow. It's not going to fill the gap that we have when it comes to energy. But what it will do is to keep staff who are well trained in nuclear issues, who may well be very useful when it comes to the nuclear weapons programme. So the two things, I think, can't be divorced. And as I say, we can't ignore either how Boris Johnson intends to emulate and woo his US counterpart. Trump is most definitely a man more interested in building walls than windmills. He's repeatedly turned his back on international cooperation, most famously, of course, dragging the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He's also trashed the arms trade treaty. The US is not going to sign that, even though many British governments successively worked hard to achieve it. He's withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, the INF Treaty, and is championing the use of what he calls usable nuclear weapons in the US military strategy. I wanted to give a quick quote from a CND Vice President, Rebecca Johnson, who's also the Green Party's spokesperson on security and peace issues. And she has said, and I quote, "The INF Treaty was the product of public rebellion, but it was signed in 1987 by just 2 leaders, and now it's been killed off by 2 more. For 30 years, the nuclear launchers have stayed off the roads of Europe. They will be deployed again unless we can take these nuclear options away from everyone." So that tearing up of that Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty is deeply significant. And finally, on the roll call of things that Trump has unfortunately done, of course, he's pulled the US out of the Iran nuclear deal as well. A deal that was of such importance, a real breakthrough when it came to trying to at least resolve years of nuclear build-up and international tensions concerning nuclear threats and sanctions. And by announcing the US withdrawal from the JCPOA agreement last year, I think he's undone many years of hard work by the EU, but interestingly as well by China, by Russia, Germany and France, as well as by the US, UK and Iran. And he's jeopardised the fragile gains that the Iran nuclear deal brought to the peace and stability in the region. Yet, as I say, the US is first on Boris Johnson's list for closer trade deals in a post-Brexit UK. And so in an already dangerous world, we have 2 morally bankrupt and ambitious men in powerful positions for whom instability and chaos are nothing more than what they call bumps in the road, but what the rest of us would call kind of cavernous sinkholes that really do threaten our futures. So I'm sure many of you will have come out tonight really hoping not to hear anything more about Brexit, and I apologise because I am going to say a few words about the EU, but I genuinely think it is so significant. Yeah. I genuinely believe that if we are to be serious about safety and security, if we are to look for much needed leadership and hope, then our membership of the EU is crucial. In the debate that preceded the EU referendum, I think it's horrendous, really, how peace played such a small part in that referendum campaign. You know, all of the campaign from the Remain side was about the economy. You know, that phrase, you know, don't risk it, without even recognising that for so many people in this country, they felt they had nothing left to risk when it came to their own economic situation. But no one really explained about the role that the EU has played when it comes to fostering democracy, development and the rule of law. How it has provided citizens with the freedom to travel, to study, to work and to make friendships across countries. And those friendships, those personal relations, I think, are so important when it comes to imagining what kind of future relations we'll have with the rest of the world. How the EU helped us emerge from the rubble and the destruction of the Second World War into a nation that's been at peace with its neighbours, its immediate neighbours at least, ever since. You know, that was a miracle that few would have dreamt possible when the bombs were raining down. And of course the EU has been far from perfect, and as someone who's been a member of the European Parliament, I've seen up front that it is far from perfect. But you know what? Westminster is far from perfect, and no one is talking about, at least I don't think they're talking about scrapping the House of Commons. Actually, that might have been Boris Johnson's latest wheeze, but essentially I think you need to stay in and reform it rather than turning your back on it. Because in 60 years, I'd argue that the EU's done far more for peace and security than any number of nuclear weapons. I think it has symbolised lighting a candle rather than cursing the darkness. And I'm sure I'm not the only one to worry that the upheaval of Brexit will do irreparable harm to the development of a Europe committed to peace and progress, and that it will make us less secure, not more. If it goes ahead, I think we'll pay not just the economic price that everyone's talking about, but a massive price in terms of our security. And if I could just say a few words as well about the situation in Northern Ireland, because frankly, the recklessness, the carelessness with which so many politicians now are talking about having a hard border again in Northern Ireland, I think is so deeply worrying. Many are warning that it could lead again to very real instability and tension when it comes to Northern Ireland. And many in Northern Ireland would point out that the peace process is a process. It's not finished. It still needs more confidence, and the confidence came from situating both the mainland and Northern Ireland within the European Union. So can I just say that if we do get a people's vote on Brexit, I just think it's so important that all of us who care about peace and nuclear weapons do go out there and make the positive case around peace when it comes to that referendum, because I don't think we can take for granted that if we get that people's vote that we will win it. So we need to be making those positive cases for the EU. If Britain voted again tomorrow, I think the demographics of this country probably would have shifted in favour of staying in the EU, but that is not enough. This isn't just about winning at the ballot box, it's about winning a different kind of shared future. And that's why I think we need to be talking about an EU of the people, an EU of solidarity. It's those values that helped create that institution, and it's those values that I think we need to uphold. Now, the story of the peace movement is rich with examples of people transforming history, and I wanted tonight to try to be upbeat, because I know there's so many reasons for feeling a bit grim at the moment, and certainly a whole record of looking at nuclear conflict and places where countries are at war is very depressing. So I wanted to just remind us that we can make a difference, and there are some great examples of people who have made a difference. And one of those that inspires me actually is the example of Harold Wilson. As Prime Minister during the Vietnam War, he was under huge pressure from the US to commit troops to that conflict, as Australia did. And yet he came under pressure by CND members, by an active peace movement. And as a result, he refused, putting Britain on the right side on that occasion of justice and peace. And of course, it would be easy to contrast that with Tony Blair's decision to ignore the wisdom and concerns of millions of people to join the US in George Bush's dangerous, destabilising war on Iraq. But whilst the immediate outcome of all of those protests on the street and all of the letters that were written and the petitions that were signed and the delegations that went to Number 10, although they didn't succeed in the short term, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that in the longer term, I think something did change. And that is that when David Cameron, for example, was contemplating attacking Syria, he dared not act without coming first to Parliament. And the scrutiny to which he was subjected, and subsequently Theresa May, when she too sought to take military action, was a direct result of the public outcry after the Iraq War. And I've tabled a parliamentary motion calling for legislation to make it mandatory that any decision to commit our troops to war should be approved by Parliament. That doesn't obviously mean that necessarily the decision that we would want gets made, but it gives us a better chance of being able to lobby our elected representatives to have that debate in public and hopefully to be able to make a much more informed decision. I'm confident that we will one day have those right checks and balances on those who would prefer waging war to the much more challenging task of waging peace. I think we should take heart as well of the things that have managed to gain global support. So the British government ended up signing the treaties that banned biological weapons in 1972, chemical weapons in 1993, nuclear testing in 1996, landmines in 1997, cluster munitions in 2008. And in each case, it was public pressure that persuaded politicians and their advisors to do the right thing in the end. And now, of course, the big job ahead of us is to get that same momentum behind the idea of banning nuclear weapons. And it is a huge job, and I don't underestimate it for a moment. But let's not forget that it is also a task where progress has started. A couple of years ago, in 2017, I was fortunate enough to be part of a CND delegation to the United Nations as diplomats from all around the world negotiated a groundbreaking new treaty to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons. Now, that treaty was overwhelmingly adopted by the UN General Assembly, even though, and this is the shameful thing, that the British government left its seat at the UN completely empty. So empty, in fact, that I went and sat on it for a while, and then the people told me to move. But I wanted to shame them. I mean, at the very least, not to be there to observe just felt to be so shameful. You know, because when we have these debates about unilateral nuclear disarmament in Parliament, then the government always says, we're not in favour of unilateral nuclear disarmament, we want multilateral nuclear disarmament. Well, OK, let's take them at their word. Here is a multilateral UN global ban treaty. And yet they couldn't even be bothered to show up and sit in their seat at that UN debate. But I believe that that UN Global Ban Treaty is the foundation for safety and security in a dangerous world. There is no scenario in which nuclear bombs make us safer. And whilst nations continue to possess those weapons of mass destruction, I think we are all under threat. The good news is that 70 nations signed that treaty despite heavy political pressure from some of the nuclear-armed states not to do it. And we heard stories, for example, about some poorer countries which were recipients of US aid were being told that their aid would stop if they signed up to this treaty, which, in terms of moral bankruptcy, that seems to me to come fairly near the top. But we had 70 nations who've signed it. 2 years later, 25 of those have got as far as ratifying it. More are expected to complete their ratifications later this month at a special high-level meeting at the UN. And so I think we can have real hope that if we keep up this pressure, and if that pressure is kept up across the world, that we could reach the 50 nations ratifying it that is required for it to come into force. And while some European nations, including Ireland and Austria, have been at the forefront when the UN achieved the nuclear ban treaty, of course it is the NATO members who are the most resistant, arguing that it could undermine nuclear deterrence. But I really think, the arguments are on our side when it comes to those debates, which maybe is why no one actually wants to debate it much in Parliament. Because, if we are really arguing, or if they are really arguing that in order to be safe we need nuclear weapons, then what possible moral justification can they have for trying to prohibit any other country from seeking to acquire nuclear weapons at all? What possible right do we think we have to lecture countries like Iran that they can't have nuclear weapons if we ourselves not only are planning to keep ours but are upgrading them? You cannot have two different rules. And of course that was at the heart of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT Treaty. That was based on two parts of a bargain. One was that countries that don't have nuclear weapons should not seek to acquire them. But the other half of that bargain, which nuclear states choose to ignore, is that those states that do have nuclear weapons will negotiate in good faith to get rid of theirs. And it feels to me that a UK government that couldn't even be bothered to sit in a meeting where that global ban treaty was being agreed is not keeping to its part of that bargain when it comes to the NPT. So, we desperately need that global ban treaty. I think it's really exciting that it was agreed. I think that the awarding of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize to the campaigners who brought about that ban treaty shows what civil society and diplomats and parliamentarians can do when we work together for disarmament. And so the challenge now is to be relentless in bringing pressure to bear on the UK to back the treaty, by combining values-based commitment to a positive, peaceful future with practical, concrete steps forward. I think we've already helped to make the world a less dangerous place than it would be otherwise, and we can do it again. I want to talk as well about two further, very specific ways in which perhaps we could try to harness the power that we have, that power of equal parts optimism and realism. And the first, I think, is to demand a rewrite of the UK's national security strategy, as Greens will be demanding at the forthcoming general election. And of course, it sounds very impressive, a national security strategy. But actually, when you look at the current strategy, it is ill thought through. It's based on the wrong assumptions and objectives. And worst of all, it doesn't really properly engage with the issues, and certainly not the root causes of conflict around the world. I think we need a national security strategy that is worthy of the name, and that we need meaningful public engagement in security policy development. You know, at a time when our democratic rights are under massive attack, and perhaps never more so than in the last week or so, I think giving citizens a voice in a new creative ways must be fundamental to reviving our democracy in any case, but certainly in terms of having a debate about what our defence policy should be. So I think it would be useful to imagine what a people's national security strategy might actually look like, one that really does address the underlying causes as well as the short-term threats to safety and security. One that tackles problems at source, giving people hope, a stake in their communities, more control over their lives by underlining democracy and the rule of law. Finding ways to reduce tensions and resolve conflicts. You know, why is it that we spend so much more on waging war than we ever do in terms of, in our universities and our research institutes, trying to work out how we bring about peace? How do we work out how to replace economic exploitation with economic cooperation? How do we build up international institutions rather than tearing them down? How do we replace wars of adventures with respect for international law and a guarantee that we will refuse to host the US or anyone else's nuclear missiles? Redirecting resource allocations away from the current disproportionate targeting towards costly military capabilities, towards preventative and peace-building measures instead. And to me, one of the short-term wins in that might just be something around the arms trade, because it is obscene, and I think many people think it's obscene that we do have the largest arms fair in London happening just this last week. I want to pay tribute to the protesters who were outside that arms fair last week, who were drawing attention to the fact that the UK has sold $4.7 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia since 2015, weapons that we know have been used to kill civilians in Yemen. Oxfam brought out a report last week that showed that Britain has earned 8 times more from the arms sales to Saudi Arabia and other members of that coalition who are fighting in Yemen than it is spent on aid to help the civilians that are caught up in that conflict. So how does that make any sense at all, that we are spending so much more in terms of the weapons that are generating that war than we are to actually helping the people who are caught up in it? So instead, I think we need to be showing real leadership in arms reduction negotiations. I think we need to give new impetus to nuclear non-proliferation by immediately suspending plans for a replacement for Trident. And you might think, well, that sounds highly unlikely when you've got a Boris Johnson government. And on one level, I know what you mean. But on another level, one of the good things about Boris Johnson, no, not one of the good things, there aren't many. But anyway, one of the less bad things about Boris Johnson is that he doesn't believe in anything. And so, in a sense, he's more open to, short-term strategic. If you just tell him, here's a whole load of money that you could have if you weren't spending $200 billion on Trident, he might actually be more open to that argument, ironically, than some prime ministers earlier than him, prior to him. We need a different approach to international trade talks. All of these things are interconnected. Globalisation should not be about handing power to multinational corporations. It should be about a force for good, if it means agreeing international standards, for example, for the environment, for workers' rights, for health and safety. We need a new approach to equality, rejecting the dominant narratives about what makes us more secure, and instead focusing on the ecological, the economic, and the democratic failures that are what makes the world more dangerous. And crucially, I think, an effective national security strategy would start by redefining what security is and not defining it purely in military terms, but defining it in terms of what enables us to feel safe in our communities and in our countries going forward. And that isn't just about military might. We need to be setting out the principles on which it could be built and set out a roadmap against which to measure progress. So building windmills in the face of storms is all about doing practical things to prepare for the kind of future that we want. And I want to give one last example of that before I finish, because it seems as well that in terms of building a safer world and a safer country, we need to literally build Lao Tzu's windmills. We need to literally be doing far more to tackle the climate crisis and making common cause, as I said at the very beginning, with organisations like XR and others. Over 10 years ago, I helped to formulate plans for what we called then a Green New Deal. A Green New Deal is basically a massive investment in renewable energy, energy efficiency. It would revitalise our economy. It would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. It would get people's fuel bills down. It would more or less pay for itself in terms of the tax revenue from those new jobs. It would be a hopeful thing. It would unleash the skills and potential of the British people, while laying the foundations for a carbon-free ecological future, an ecologically sustainable future. And we called it a Green New Deal because we were looking back to the New Deal that President Roosevelt put in place back in the 1930s. And he got the US out of depression through a massive program of building roads and bridges and so on. I don't want to see lots of roads and bridges, but what I do want to see is that massive investment in the green economy that I think could be transformative. And as I said, 10 years ago, a number of us in this country got together and formulated plans for a Green New Deal, and it got a bit of publicity, but frankly not very much. But then, over in the States, a Democratic congresswoman whom you might have heard of, called Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has picked up this idea and has run with it and has absolutely transformed the debate around it. And now there are huge numbers of organisations in this country too looking about how we could be part of that Green New Deal. How do we build that ecological basis for the jobs and the positive future that we need in this country? But it was quite interesting to me that there's a guy called Matt Corder of the Nuclear Information Project who writes about having a Green New Deal for nuclear weapons as well. And he explains that the climate and peace movements must work together because of common stakes, common challenges, and most importantly, common solutions. He argues that the kind of racist and colonial policies have all contributed to the development of the nuclear complex as well as to climate change, and that a founding principle of the Green New Deal is stopping current, preventing future, and repairing historic oppression of frontline and vulnerable communities. And it therefore follows that alongside climate justice, we need to be demanding restorative nuclear justice, offering environmental and economic reparations to those frontline communities who've had their lives absolutely undermined by, for example, nuclear weapons detonations around the world. So as we strive for net zero emissions, I think we must also aim for net zero nuclear weapons and make stronger links between those two movements. And I think as well, just as the Green New Deal talks about what the unions often call a just transition, in other words, how do you make sure that workers are in the forefront of redesigning the work that they do to make sure that it is in sustainable forms of work rather than unsustainable forms, just as we have that just transition for the Green New Deal when it comes to fossil fuels and moving away from fossil fuels, so we need those defence diversification agencies that can help people who are currently involved in the nuclear industry, for example, imagine and get the skills they need and the support they need and the finance they need to be able to make sure that they have jobs in a non-nuclear future. Because I think one of the biggest obstacles to getting rid of our nuclear weapons, people come back again and again in Parliament saying, well, all of those jobs that are wrapped up in nuclear weapons. Well, CND, to its credit, has done a lot of work, particularly Scottish CND, on how, in fact, a non-nuclear world, if you use that money differently, that 200 billion, could create many times more jobs than the current in Trident. But it's not enough just to assert that. You know, if I worked in the nuclear industry myself, I wouldn't want to just know numbers on a piece of paper. I would want to know exactly how that transition is going to happen and where the finance is going to come from to make it happen. And I think if we can make common cause with some of the workers around that and absolutely say they need to be in the forefront of redesigning that transition and that they must be good quality, skilled jobs in a green economy too, then I think perhaps we could bring them on board with us as well. So, in conclusion, that is what a progressive nuclear revolution looks like, I think. And I think it could be a way for the peace movement to evolve as well. Humanity faces new, bigger, and crucially more interconnected and dangerous challenges. We know that our leaders don't have the answers. And if we're to provide the leadership that's needed, then I think we need to be more interconnected as well. And that means joining up with allies who are involved in different parts of the wider movement, but with whom we can make common cause. Because safety and security in a dangerous world is at heart about justice. It's not about military boots on the ground. It's about whether or not you can afford to have shoes on your feet. It's not about how many Typhoon jets you command. It's whether your home can withstand the typhoons that climate chaos is bringing about. So by joining forces with those who stop deportation flights from taking off, or with the volunteers at the food banks, or the pioneers of community-owned energy and banks, the occupiers of diggers, the opponents of fracking, and all those who face harassment and arrest and imprisonment for their work, I think we can bring a new energy and power and the force of hope to our demands for progress and change. And I think by doing that, we at least have a chance of making our very dangerous world rather more safe and more secure. Thank you.